This case takes place in Mozambique in the year 2016. This case starts with a journey of a lifetime and ends in an unthinkable tragedy. The local police offered little help, and the authorities back home also failed her. The truth was buried in contradictions, cover-ups and silence, but with every piece of evidence uncovered, the questions only grow darker. This is the case of Elly Warren, and it is far from over. Elly Rose Warren was born on the 24th of June 1996 in Melbourne, Australia, to her father Paul and mother Nicole Warren. She spent her childhood in Mozambique, a coastal suburb of the city, where she was raised in a loving and adventurous family. The Warrens frequently travelled within Australia and abroad, fostering Elly's passion for the outdoors and wildlife. At 15, during a family trip to Africa in 2012, she developed a deep admiration for the continent's people and diverse wildlife. According to her father, this experience left a lasting impression, inspiring her to explore the world further. Upon returning to Australia, she set her sights on travelling across different countries. After completing high school, Elly took on various jobs to fund her journeys. Over the following years, she travelled solo to Central America, Bali, Thailand, among other destinations. She also balanced her ambition with her love for exploration. She was academically gifted, and she had secured a place at James Cook University in Queensland to study marine biology, aiming for a career that would allow her to work closely with animals whilst continuing her travels. But before beginning her studies, she planned one final adventure. This was an educational trip back to Africa. At the age of 20, she arranged a 6-week volunteer program in Mozambique with the research organisation known as Africa Underwater. Africa Underwater hires volunteers to assist marine biologists in studying the coral reefs just off the coast. Elly was living her dream, but that dream was tragically cut short. She left for Mozambique, but she never returned. What's unsettling is that before Elly set off on her journey in 2016, she voiced her hesitation to her father. She told her father that she didn't know if she should go or not, and stated that the country is very dangerous. But Elly had experience in other unsafe countries, and to her, the pros outweighed the doubts. In September of 2016, Elly set off for Mozambique. Upon arriving in the country, she stayed at the African Underwater's accommodation, known as Casa Barry Lodge, in the bustling tourist town of Tofo. Tofo was known as a relatively safe destination for expats with a reputation for low crime and a laid-back way of life. Each day, she explored the Indian Ocean, diving and studying marine life. It was everything that she had dreamed of. And she even made a very close friend out there named Jade O'Shea. Jade described Elly as outgoing, energetic, and deeply passionate about her volunteer work. There wasn't a huge drinking or party culture in Tofo, but the volunteers often met up for some sociable drinks. One night before the end of her trip, Elly and the other volunteers were socializing and drinking at Casa Barry, but Elly and another person got into an argument. The result was that Elly was banned from drinking whilst staying at the lodge. However, Elly saw this as an opportunity to leave Casa Barry at the end of her volunteering period to spend a few extra days travelling the area. After a few days, Elly returned to Tofo on the 8th of November to say goodbye to her new friends, as she was planning to head back to Australia to start her studies. Her plans were to stay in a hostel, but before she checked in, she went to meet her friends, including Jade, at around 6:30 p.m. at Casa Barry. Elly had just arrived in the city, and she still had with her bags. At Casa Barry, she was accepting of her alcohol ban. The last photo of Elly alive was taken on the balcony of Casa Barry with a bottle of water on the table, whilst her friends were drinking alcohol. Elly's friends were becoming intoxicated, and the night was young. And so, the group went ahead to a bar they used to go together called Victor's Bar, a local bar near the marketplace. Elly dropped off her bags at the hostel and took some time to refresh and change her clothing before heading back out to meet her group of friends at Victor's Bar. As the night went on, Elly was reported to have not drunk a great deal. One of the friends said that she had one beer before the group went back to a local person's house which they had befriended. Ellie had one cocktail and likely didn't drink anything else. After about an hour, Ellie wanted to head back to Victor's bar. Her friends were not yet ready to leave this party, so she decided to go back on her own. When Ellie's friends returned to Victor's bar, some fellow expats told them that Ellie had come back and was looking for them. Victor's bar was extremely busy, so the friends brought some beers and went to sit on the beach waiting for Ellie to turn up. And so she did. Shortly after, around 11 p.m, Ellie walked around the corner and said, "I was just looking for you guys." Apparently Ellie was in good spirits and was having a good time. She wasn't drunk, and nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. She headed back into the bar alone to get another beer. Her friend sat outside, presuming that she would go in, grab some beer, and then rejoin them on the beach. But she never did. Minutes passed, and there was still no sign of her. At around 11:30 a.m. on the 9th of November, the group decided to head back to their accommodation. The following morning rolled around. Those in the village began to awaken. One of these early risers was a local fisherman. He began walking towards the marketplace. But on his way, he passed a small toilet block near the edge of the market. Something caught his eye, something pale, against the earth-toned sand. He slowly began walking towards whatever was on the ground. To his horror, there, lying face down in the sand, was a young woman. He took a step back, realizing the gravity of the situation, and called for the emergency services. Within moments, the peaceful morning was shattered by the arrival of police. Locals gathered as they speculated what could have happened and who this woman was. The young woman was Elly Warren. Ellie was lifeless. It was reported that she was found lying on her stomach, with her lower limbs stretched out and partially open, with her underwear pulled down to her knees. She was wearing a black blouse, and her mouth and nostrils were pressed against the ground. She had cuts and bruises to her neck and mouth. An investigation swiftly began. The last person reported to have seen Ellie alive was a security guard called Raphael, who was working a night shift at Hotel Tofo. He recalled seeing Ellie at around 2 a.m. on the 9th of November, walking towards her hostel. This was very out of character for Ellie, and unlike her to go off on her own and stay out hours without communicating with her friends. He said she was alone and appeared to be heavily intoxicated. He said he then saw her a few minutes later coming back from the hostel and was heading back to the marketplace area. The Mozambique Criminal Investigation Police arrived on the crime scene, cordoned off the area, and conducted an inspection. Meanwhile, Ellie's family were told of the devastating news. Now, this is where the case becomes extremely strange. In the immediate aftermath of her death in November of 2016, a police spokesperson came forward and said that her death was sudden and unexplained, with no visible signs of violence or SA. An autopsy was then conducted in Mozambique on the 9th of November 2016. This autopsy suggested that Ellie had died from asphyxiation due to inhaling sand. The report suggested that she had collapsed face first into the sand and inhaled it, leading to her death. They noted that there was no significant signs of external trauma or SA. However, the exact cause of her collapse remained undetermined. In response to this news, the Australian government tasked a man named Blake Gray with travelling to Tofo to gather information. In search for answers as to what happened, Blake spoke with several locals, including the fisherman who had discovered Ellie's body. This man had actually taken a photograph of the crime scene, but he was unable to share it electronically. Instead, Blake took a photograph of the photograph. This meant that Blake's image was blurry. Blake also spoke to another local who worked at the Peri Peri divers called Steve. Steve was one of the first people on the scene after Ellie's body was discovered, and he had initially identified her. Steve told Blake that he believed that this was no accident. He explained that he believed that Ellie had been murdered. He continued by telling Blake that the sand in Ellie's mouth appeared to have been tightly packed in, like someone had stuffed her mouth full of sand and pressed down. On the 16th of November 2016, Ellie's body was taken to South Africa. Here, another autopsy was conducted. This autopsy was consistent with the previous one, that she had died from asphyxiation from inhaling sand. However, the doctor discovered that Ellie had inhaled a significant amount of sand whilst she was still alive, but the sand was compact to such a degree that it resembled concrete. This suggested a deliberate act, as the force required to push sand into the esophagus was inconsistent with accidental inhalation. A toxicology report was also carried out, which found no evidence of any illegal substances in her body. So far, the evidence is pointing towards her being brutally stuffed with sand, yet the exact circumstances of how the sand entered her system remained a mystery, and whether or not it was murder could not be concluded by the team. Now, this is where things get even more confusing, strange, and frustrating. An Australian Federal Police investigator named Noel Scruton travelled to Tofo to examine the crime scene and the body of Ellie. This investigator took photographs and a sample of sand from the toilet and marketplace area. The following day, he travelled to South Africa and examined Ellie's body. It was clear to this investigator that the sand he had retrieved from the crime scene was not the same sand that was lodged in Ellie's mouth. This showed that something sinister had happened, and provided factual evidence that the sand that was placed inside her mouth and lungs was from another location. So, not only was she violently killed by stuffing sand in her airways, this occurred in one place, and then she was picked up and dumped in another place. Then, a third autopsy was undertaken in Australia, after Ellie's body was repatriated on the 22nd of November 2016. Again, sand was found in her airways, but the Australian autopsy report ultimately concluded that there was insufficient evidence to prove that a murder had occurred, and concluded the cause of death as undetermined. And so, we have a large body of factual evidence indicating that Ellie was brutally murdered, but no autopsy report wanted to stick its head above the parapet and call it what it was. Throughout this time, the Warren family was growing impatient. They believed that the Australian Federal Police and the police in Mozambique weren't doing enough. On the 25th of November, a clear photograph of the crime scene was sent from the fishermen to the Australian authorities. The photo clearly showed cuts, bruises, and Ellie's ripped clothing, which was further evidence of a violent struggle. Yet, the Australian authorities did nothing. Despite having this critical image, they waited for the Mozambique report, offering no action or assistance to the Mozambique authorities. With this, the Warren family was left in the dark. They were never told about the damning evidence suggesting Ellie's violent death. And now comes the extremely frustrating part. In the months that followed Ellie's death, the Mozambique police continued investigating, but it wasn't until April of 2017, 6 months after her death, that they finally sent the Australian authorities the first formal police findings. This 2-page report concluded that Ellie had died from a drug overdose. Now, this is despite a toxicology report being carried out which concluded that no substances were found in her body which would indicate that she died of an overdose. The Australian authorities assumed that this was just an error and requested that they reissue the report. 4 days later, on the 20th of April, another police report landed, which stated that the cause of death could be homicide. This error cast serious doubt on the Mozambique authorities. Why would this first report ever have been drafted, if not to pull the wool over the Australian authorities' eyes? They made this report, which ignored their own autopsies, technical conclusions, and crime scene photographs. This begged the question, were they attempting to mislead the Australian government and quietly close the case? The Warren family were rightly furious, and they refused to accept the contradictions. But their frustrations, they didn't stop there. The Australian Federal Police were aware of both reports and received them, yet despite being informed of the homicide ruling, they failed to act. A formal request which would allow the Australian authorities to assist with the investigation is called a Mutual Assistance Request. This mutual assistance request was never sent. The Warren family became convinced that the Australian government was not treating Ellie's clear murder seriously. After all, if the case was now being treated as a homicide, why was there no movement from the Australian authorities? Paul Warren, who is Ellie's father, began to suspect that the authorities, much like their counterparts in Mozambique, wanted the case to fade quietly into the background. But Paul refused to let this happen. He became determined to uncover the truth, and he launched his own investigation. One of the Australian detectives travelled back to Mozambique in August of 2017 in an attempt to collect evidence. This detective requested crime scene photographs, even though the Australian authorities already had a clear photograph showing what they needed from the fisherman who found her body. When the detective requested these images, the Mozambique police claimed that they were stored on a broken mobile phone. In response, this detective provided local currency to repair the broken mobile phone and retrieve the images. However, these photographs were never officially handed over. Just keep that bit in mind. Ellie's father Paul had seen that the case had gone cold and decided to take matters into his own hands. In October of 2018, he travelled to Mozambique, reciting his daughter's final steps. He put posters around Tofo, pleading with locals to come forward with any information they had. Within just 2 days, he was contacted by a local man who had a clear, high-quality photograph of Ellie's body, taken just after she had been discovered. This clearer image revealed crucial evidence that had never been disclosed to the Warren family. Ellie's blouse had been torn apart from the shoulder all the way down to her right side. This strongly suggested a violent struggle. Paul also spoke to 2 locals who had been near the scene of the crime shortly after Ellie's body was found, and what these 2 local men told Paul raised alarming inconsistencies. They recalled seeing Ellie's body in a different position to that of the photograph taken by the fisherman. According to them, Ellie was found leaning forward, in what they described as resembling a Muslim prayer position, with her face pressed to the ground. Yet, the crime scene photo taken by the fisherman showed her body laid out flat. This strongly indicated that someone had moved her after she was found, potentially to stage the scene. Paul was suspicious that the police assisted in some kind of cover-up. Paul then met with the officer in charge of Ellie's case in Tofo. During their conversation, the officer made a shocking admission. The police officer said that Ellie had likely been murdered elsewhere and then moved to the toilet block where her body was later discovered. He explained that the sand found in her mouth did not match the sand at the scene, meaning that she had been forced to inhale it in a different location, just like D.S. Scruton had concluded. This single statement contradicted years of official reports, which the Australian authorities stated the toilet area was the scene of the crime. This meant that someone had deliberately relocated her body to that public area, potentially to make her death appear accidental. The Australian police knew of this theory, but it was never reported to the Warren family. Furious, Paul began confronting the Australian Federal Police and demanded answers. When his emails were ignored, he started carbon copying government officials into the messages, forcing a response. In March of 2019, the Australian Federal Police finally replied, but rather than addressing his concerns, they warned him to stop sending mass emails, claiming that it could compromise this diplomatic process. To Paul, this confirmed his worst fear, that the Australian police wanted the case to disappear quietly. Then, in March of 2021, there was another breakthrough. Paul received a tip-off from a woman who had recently visited Tofo. She reported that locals whispered about a man named Tony, a powerful figure in the area's crime and drug trade. According to this woman, her children had overheard a conversation where Tony was accused of being involved in Ellie's death. The woman described Tony as covered in tattoos, including a teardrop on his face, and claimed that he was extremely dangerous. With this lead, Paul teamed up with a German private investigator known as Mad Mick. The plan was to launch an undercover sting operation. They hired a woman to infiltrate Tony's circle, hoping to get a confession. Over several weeks, she recorded multiple conversations, though none of these conversations directly mentioned Ellie. However, as the operation progressed, the woman became increasingly afraid. This Tony was paranoid and unpredictable. The risk then became too great, and Paul and Nick called off the operation before she could press him for more details. In 2021, after years of dead ends, Ellie's mother hired a lawyer in Mozambique, forcing the authorities to reopen the case. This led to another major breakthrough. In May of 2023, the authorities in Mozambique officially formally ruled Ellie's death as a homicide. Not just a police report, but more of a public announcement. They even identified potential suspects, but claimed there was insufficient evidence for the arrests. Then, in December of 2023, the Australian inquest into Ellie's death was concluded. The state coroner of Victoria acknowledged that homicide was possible, but refused to officially rule it as murder, citing a lack of definitive proof. Despite the overwhelming evidence, including the sand density analysis, crime scene inconsistencies, eyewitness testimony, and different sand in Ellie's mouth to the crime scene, the coroner stopped short of declaring foul play. This decision was a crushing blow to Paul's search for justice. Authorities in Mozambique had explicitly stated that this case was indeed a homicide, yet Australia refused to back them. Tragically, this weakened the case abroad, making it even less likely that Mozambique would continue investigating or prosecuting suspects. As of February 2025, the mutual assistance request has still not been sent, despite being an essential tool for international cooperation. Paul Warren continues to fight for the truth. If she was still alive, Elly Warren would have been a successful 28-year-old traveling marine biologist. There is no doubt to that. Instead, her life was cut tragically short, and her government wants to sweep her under the carpet, allowing her murderer or murderers to roam free. 9 years after Ellie's death, the case remains unsolved.